You're listening to Agile Ideas, the podcast, hosted by Fatima Abuchi.
For anyone listening out there not having a good day, please know there is help out there.
Even with whole Agile, like Agile's been around for, over 2 decades, like 2-3 decades. But even when we think about it, conceptually, project management 101 is something that people like us that are in projects, we understand. But I'm sure you would agree with me that if you talk to someone in finance or someone in HR and someone in audit or, another department, unless they've been in projects, they probably struggle to get project management 101. Fair? So then think about it this way. We already spend a lot of time trying to educate them on project management. Now what we're doing is we now need to educate them on project management and on Agile. And if you think about it, some of us, myself included, a few years ago, also have to understand Agile for us to help explain it to those people too, right? This is why Agile governance and governance in Agile is so confusing right now. A lot of people didn't pay as much attention to governance because when governance is going well, you typically don't hear about it. You don't talk about it. And we know that HR and finance and audit and risk, they've all got governance, all sorts of governance we have to comply with. And now in delivery, we've just complied with it. The difference is now in delivery, we've changed the way we work to be more agile. And now we need to have those areas that are outside of us change the way they work to enable us to move at speed and to be leaner. So that's where the sort of starting thinking is going. Welcome, Kayla, and welcome, Tony. We've just kicked off. Thanks for joining us. So I want to just quickly share, for those that are not super familiar, when we think about Agile, it's all of this. You might have heard the term big A Agile and small A Agile. Have you all heard of that terminology in your organizations? Yes? Yep. Okay, great. Sometimes people get the two confused. When we're thinking about small A Agile, that is the behaviors and the mindset. It's A in terms of agility, moving at speed. It's all of the stuff that doesn't relate to, SAFe or a McKinsey methodology or anything. It doesn't relate to any of that. It is just around the cultural change and the behaviors and the mindset. That is critical in order to move and do big A Agile stuff, which is around methods, which you can see towards the bottom, right? A lot of organizations will typically, and I've seen this so many times in the last 6 years of running this business, they start always with methods, right? At the top down, typically what happens, I've seen this at least half a dozen times in the last 12 months alone, where a large business says we want to go Agile and they want to do it because they want to save money. And the first point of reference is almost always to cut costs, which means reducing middle management layers and resources. That's fundamentally why they started. They do say it's for innovation, for competitiveness, for lean, for this. They do say that, but really, when you look at the business case, which I've seen many of them, it's fundamentally cost cutting to start with. Rightly or wrongly, they have some challenges around that, which we'll get into. But they start with, we want to restructure the organization, and then they put in a framework or a methodology. Most of the large businesses are typically going with either SAFe, which is scaled as scaled Agile for Enterprise, or a version, a sort of a hybrid version, which, resonates around sort of Scrum or similar. But SAFe is by far, I think, the second in the world for the most leading practitioners on it. And why? Because SAFe is probably, if you look at SAFe, and I won't get into too much detail on that, but if you look at SAFe, it is pretty waterfall in its approach to roll it out, which is interesting. But that's another note. So when we think about Agile, it's behaviors, it's mindset, it's methods, it's all of that. So we need to help, even from a governance perspective, we need to help our own teams and stakeholders around us to start making that shift with the mindset and behavior in order for them to be able to help us to remove some of those impediments and roadblocks that we need. So that's probably one of the first things to think about. As I said, Agile's been around forever. The other thing that we typically usually try to help educate stakeholders that are not in our world is just taking them back to fundamental project management 101. When you think about traditional waterfall, it's, as you can see, it's pretty much plan-driven approach, and usually our scope is fixed. But when we think about Agile, what we have to remind our stakeholders, and they do struggle with this, is we're fixing the time and the cost. That's the difference. You don't have an unlimited amount of budget and an unlimited amount of time. You are fixed in that sense, but your scope can vary. Now, hands up or call out, is that something that you are seeing some of your stakeholders are struggling with as well? Struggling to understand the difference between the two. They still want everything, but they want you to do it in 3 months. It's like that can't be worked. That's not going to work. It's very, very common. So that's the sort of starting point when educating our stakeholders is helping them to understand that. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us. There is a few myths in Agile that I just wanted to bring your attention to. I'm interested to know if any of you have seen these or heard of these, and if there's any others that are not on here that you would want to call out. Feel free to yell out or put it into the chat as well. But these are sort of 6 of the main ones. You'll see the last one, Agile has no governance. Now, when people say to me there's no governance needed in Agile, I laugh, because if you think about think about governance, there's probably 4 layers of governance. And the external layer is your external regulations. That is governance. Governance that comes in from, regulators. If you're in banking, financial services, it's APRA and ASIC. If you're in sort of a different industry, there's probably rules around HR regulations we need to apply. There's all sorts of rules and regulations. That's still governance. But in delivery, we maybe don't spend as much time on that, depending on what we're working on. The second layer is corporate governance or enterprise governance. This is your enterprise policies and procedures, your corporate risk, your audit requirements, all of the things that are going to prevent your business from getting shut down, sued, lives lost, etc. And then within that circle, there's where we talk about project governance. Now, I don't care whether it's a project, an initiative, change, whatever you want to call it, but fundamentally, we're talking about project governance. That's the third layer. Now, project governance is where we are talking about today and where we're playing in today. And this is where we're having to see quite a lot of challenges in organisations around why there's a disconnect between project governance and enterprise governance. It's the gap between the two. I can tell you firsthand through recent conversations with some of the bigger consultancies that they, when moving and implementing Agile, not just them, but a lot of companies, what they've done is for example, in one bank, they eliminated a lot of their project management officers. They eliminated them. They were gone. I did a survey with some CIOs a couple of years ago, and I asked them, with the rise of Agile, what exactly are you doing with your project management officers? And you'd be surprised, more than 2/3 were either downsizing or dissolving their PMOs. In those exact same organisations, I've seen firsthand they're now reintroducing those functions back in, because I've realised governance is not just PMO. Governance is so much greater than that. It's those layers that I talked about. And the final layer in the centre is self-governance, the governance, the way that we as individuals interact in our roles day to day and what we do to help an organisation. So Agile has no governance is completely false, and it's something that I think people often tend to use. Is there any other myths that come to mind for anyone that they wanted to call out, or something they've heard or something they wanted to ask about?
Hi, Fatima, it's Tony here.
Yeah.
I think one of the myths that I've come across is that, especially with governance in terms of finance, that financial models cannot be linked to Agile.
Yeah, which is completely false. I'll give you an example, a real example. So some of the larger organizations, they do change their financial management processes. I will be honest, I've not yet seen one that's purely Agile, even though there's no proper definition for pure Agile. If you look at SAFE, for example, they've got a whole sort of chapter around portfolio and lean budget guardrails and all of that sort of stuff. But in reality, what's happening is organizations, particularly the large ones, they still do their enterprise planning around budgets and financial control, and they determine what they're going to do. And then what they do is they take what they call funding envelopes, and they create funding envelopes, which is just a fancy name for buckets of money. And they then distribute those funding envelopes to the divisions or the tribes in Agile, the tribes that then are accountable, and it's usually a GM or a managing director level, who then are accountable for disseminating the money to meet certain goals and objectives and OKRs that they plan to achieve. So they still do waterfall planning at the top, but then when we're going into the next layer, they actually go, okay, MD, John Smith or Mary Smith, we're going to give you this bucket, and it's your responsibility within your tribe and your sub-tribes and the squads within it to spend that money the way that you think you're going to best provide value to meet our organisational goals. So I've seen it. It's possible, and it's probably more mature now because of the work that's been happening, at least in banking and financial services. But it's a little bit more harder in smaller organisations because the comprehension around Agile is not as advanced, because the extent of which the larger businesses have gone to, they've spent tens of millions of dollars just on their models, let alone the whole Agile transformation. And medium and small businesses just don't have that sort of money. Any other thoughts at this point around any myths in Agile or any sort of clarifications that anyone wants to raise?
I just wanted to add, excuse me, on the topic there around work must fit into a sprint. Mm-hmm. As a myth, mm-hmm. I think that's very true. And also, this defining a sprint, mm-hmm. it can be customizable to the organization. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can define what your sprint is. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks or a month. It can be anything. Yep. And I've worked in an organization where we set up a sprint period mm-hmm. to align with their quarterly reporting, and that worked really, really well. Mm-hmm. So a 3-month sprint. Mm-hmm. Some places even have a 1-year sprint.
Interesting. Very interesting. So it's interesting because for those of you that don't know, there's like well over 50 Agile-based methodologies. Agile is not a methodology, but there's Agile-based methodologies, over 50 of them. Some of them you probably never heard of, and others are really common. Sprint is a concept that applies to some methodologies, such as the Scrum framework, but it doesn't apply in others, such as the Kanban framework. So sprint doesn't exist in Kanban, because in Kanban, the model, the methodology Kanban, is based on continuous flow of work. And so there's no such thing as a sprint. But then in Scrum, there is sprints. And so depending on the methodology or framework that an organization chooses to use, they may or may not need sprints. And then again, in one organization recently, they were doing sprints every 3 weeks. And they did that to meet a vendor that was delivering their work in 3-week sprints. Problem was, at the end of every sprint, they didn't deliver anything. They picked up all of the stories in Agile, in Jira, they picked them up and they moved them to the next sprint, and they did that every single sprint. So what's the point of a sprint if you're not going to be delivering incremental value? So it's definitely very variable, and you're right, a sprint could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be longer. It's just about how, depending on the size and scale of the initiatives that you're delivering. Welcome to everyone else that's just joined. So how is Agile being applied in organisations today? So this is worth calling out, because when we think about introduction of Agile, one of the most common mistakes is organisations typically do what they normally do and say, we're going to do this big transformation and we're going to change all of this, and we're going to introduce this model, and we're going to put tribes and stand-ups and scrums and ceremonies, and they tell us about everything they're going to do and introduce that's new. What they don't do is they don't look at what they need to change that's already existing. And that's where we're seeing gaps. In the last 6 years alone, I've seen some significant gaps that have arisen simply as a result of organisations not assessing where they are today, but instead just bringing in new shiny tools and frameworks and processes and stuff. So if you're embarking on an Agile transformation, and I know earlier on I was talking to Kirsten who's doing that, you need to look at where you are today and what is the level of maturity you're at from a project delivery perspective. The more mature you are, the more likely you'll probably be able to transition to any framework or model more successfully. But if you have gaps around processes and lack of accountability between teams and disconnect between functions, you adding Agile on top of that is just going to compound the problem. It's not a band-aid fix. So you need to think about that. So when thinking about how Agile is being applied to organizations, it typically is a top-down approach, particularly in a larger business, where what they do is they start to introduce it at the company-wide level, and that's a directive that comes usually from the CEO or COO, and they start to apply it top-down. A good example of that is Barclays Bank or ANZ Bank. They basically started at the top and went all the way down. And they started at the top intentionally because they obviously wanted to get the buy-in, and it was such a significant change. The challenge was in one of those banks, as an example, they didn't meet the rest of the organization from the bottom. So they were doing things and pushing things down, but down here, they didn't actually look at fixing some of the core processes that were going to be impacting the teams that were moving into these new functions and tribes and squads and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a disconnect there. When we think about multi-department, it's, it starts in a division or a particular function. Usually that might be, across the whole of an Australia division and all of the teams, or across the Asia Pacific region or something of that sort, where they tend to try before they buy, and they might apply it in a particular region that might be more mature. A few years ago, we working within an organisation that has many locations globally. We realised that New Zealand was much more advanced in where they were in maturity. So we ended up starting with them, and they sort of led the charge. And then we brought in Australia and then some of the Asia Pacific countries. In a single department, it's typically done usually like from an IT department, because IT tends to have the most, advanced knowledge of Agile, I'm seeing anyway. And you might have some really good Agile practices. You might have DevOps. You might have something like that already is being started in IT. And so you want to build that up. And so single department introduction of Agile is common. And typically it's more in a mid-sized business. And then finally, the last one is around introducing Agile based on an individual or group of individuals that are in an organization that might just be really good at Agile from past experience. And they're like, you know what, we can be leaner, more efficient. Let's start introducing some concepts that are Agile based into testing or into development or into projects or whatever it might be. And then that way it starts from the bottom. Problem is, when you start at the bottom like that, it might only change something in a core team, but it doesn't actually help connect to the executives who need to be sponsoring this change for it to be successful. Any thoughts from any of you on what you've seen in your organisation or what you're embarking on around where Agile is being rolled out?
So I work for a large government-owned corporation in Queensland and in the digital department. So we're the first ones within the business to actually do that. But what we've done is we've actually focused on all other work, not projects. Mm-hmm. So it was about getting our platforms sorted to be able to do the Agile way of working for mm-hmm. all their work, mm-hmm. but left major changes and projects on the side. So what I'm responsible for is actually taking that now and implementing Agile for projects, mm-hmm. So that they get a clear view of all the backlog of work for their platform. So we are on the journey. Our project management practices are very mature. We've been doing this for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So this is why it's like interesting to understand how we can do that. But that's the journey that we're on.
Awesome. Okay, that sounds good. Well, starting from a higher maturity base is definitely going to help. And particularly if you've got people that are really open-minded. I know people use the whole concept of fixed mindset, growth mindset like it's nothing. But to be honest, there are definitely people that are going to champion these changes, that are really going to get on board with it. One recommendation I would make is, if you haven't already got your executives on some Agile training, whichever methodology you end up going with, get them on there. They're not any better than anyone else. They really need it, probably more than anyone, in order to be able to understand like the bigger picture, not just from a couple of slides that a consultancy put together about why Agile is important. So that would be a recommendation that I think should help.
Yeah, we're very lucky. Our exec has actually been part of Agile implementations at quite large organisations before. So she's come in and she's the driving force behind this. So we're really lucky with that.
That's excellent. And if anyone else that is in the other position where they're trying to introduce Agile, but they're really not sure exactly sort of where to start, figure out an initiative that you can trial out that's a pilot initiative, or figure out like a small team, maybe that's really high performance, there's a few of them, and you can start introducing Agile concepts in there just to kind of test and prove the concept to your executives as well. So something else to think about. All right, so I just want to sort of highlight some challenges in relation to organisations adopting Agile. And these all, you'll see, relate very much to governance. These are some of the bigger ones. There's definitely a lot of others, but I just will start with these. Biggest challenge to me at the moment is who is accountable. It sounds really simple, but when you think of a traditional waterfall governance, and depending on how mature your governance is that's based on waterfalls, what I should be saying is it's about clarity around roles and responsibilities. So you would probably have traditional role titles, traditional roles and responsibilities, clear RACI, clear function, everything would be a lot clearer. You know exactly when you've got to go to the finance for approvals, you know how audit comes in and does their audits on projects, etc., etc. When we think about what Agile has done, when it's not done well, is it's actually opened up gaping holes in structure and around governance. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is because the role titles that have been introduced are some of them are airy-fairy role titles that mean nothing. And those role titles usually mean the same role title for like 5 people. As an example, one I use a lot is in banking, they typically use the term journey expert. Now, journey expert means business analyst, it means implementation analyst, it means change analyst, it means process analyst. How are you supposed to be accountable for any of those things that you do if everybody's got the same title? So the title's not the issue, it's the way that it's been introduced to make the confusion around what those people's roles actually are. So you don't actually know whether you need implementation analyst or change analyst. It's like very confusing. So there isn't really structure around the structure around roles and responsibilities that resonates, and it's causing problems now because with removing of roles in structures and reducing, making them more lean, et cetera, it's causing some significant gaps. And then also by moving to a model that has very restrictive, role titles, which is in some Agile-based methodologies, it means that people are applying it like a one-to-one match, and it's causing confusion. So in one organization, they went full hog on random role titles, which means those people are going to struggle to find jobs in the market in future because there's no other companies using it. So they caused problems. But another organization who has approached it very similar, but what they've done is they've kept what they're calling your home role. Your home role being who's your line manager, who performance manages you, who's responsible for all of that. That's your home role. That doesn't change. In that home role, I might be a change manager. That's my day-to-day sort of core competency. But in an Agile team, because this organization doesn't have Agile across the entire organization, in the Agile team, I might be, the process SME or the Scrum Master or the whatever it might be. So there is a difference between what your role is in an Agile team from a delivery lens versus what your role is just in terms of an organizational perspective. And it may sound confusing at first, but that is far clearer than saying that person is just a journey expert, as one example. So that accountability is definitely a big gap. The other one is flavors of Agile. So this is pockets of Agile popping up that are all doing something different in 500 different ways. Agile is about accountability and ownership, yes, but there still needs to be clarity so that the cogs or the wheels can go in motion. Like we're driving a car, and if every weak tire is, a completely different size, and we don't know where we're going, which is where governance comes into it, it's going to be really difficult. Whereas if we all know what the guardrails are for what, what I'm using car example, but hopefully it's helpful. But if we all know the guardrails, what is the shell of what we need to do in our area, and there's continuity with that with other areas, but day to day we do things a little bit, that's okay, because that gives the autonomy and the freedom for Agile teams to be able to move at speed. But we need to know when we have a roadblock with resourcing, we know how to link in with HR policies and procedures. Because HR is not going to change all of their policies and procedures because Agile is for delivery, for the most part, when we think about methods and frameworks. So we just got to work out how we align that. But there is definitely a whole raft of flavors on Agile that's going on in companies. The grey area, just quickly on that one, projects and operations, I mentioned briefly before. People are very unclear about the linkages between projects and operations. Where does projects start? Where does operations start? Now, depending on which Agile based framework you're using, some of them bring operations into the mix. So, for example, rolling out a value stream model basically brings business operations and delivery all in one. Whereas in other frameworks, it's separate. So it really just depends, and it's a case-by-case basis. And then finally, in terms of governance itself, which we'll get into in more detail. Is there any other challenges that anyone else wants to call out that they're currently facing in their organisations? Keep going there. So we think about Agile itself, governance, itself. It's about two things. You want to do the right things and you want to do things right. That's governance. Fundamentally, that is governance. And if we are not clear, if everyone is not clear on what the right things to do are or how to do them right, well, you're going to have a problem around governance. Simple as that. When we think about doing things right and doing the right things, we also need to consider that it needs to be really clear where it is that we are going. So if you think of it as governance is the roadmap. Governance is the roadmap of where you're intending to go. It's like if we all got into a car now and we didn't know where we were going to meet to do this meetup, well, we're probably not going to end up anywhere close to each other. Whereas if we said to each other, we're all going to meet at Byron Bay, which I haven't been, by the way, but I'd love to go there. We're all going to meet at Byron Bay. Now, I don't mind how you get there, as long as you don't spend more than $5,000 and you need to be there in 2 weeks. Now, that's a lot more clearer. That's guardrails that I've put in place to help guide you on getting there within a time frame, and we're going to meet there. That's so much easier to understand. So governance is about that roadmap, and the processes are your glue. So I'll say that again. Governance is the roadmap. Where are you going and how you're going to get there? And the processes are the glue. So when people think about Agile governance, they usually mix it up and they think Agile delivery and they sort of align it and just assume it's the same thing. Like I've been saying for quite a while now, even from a project management office perspective, which is a place that I have played in a lot, is people assume that in a project management office that you need to apply a delivery methodology into the PMO, and your PMO needs to run based on a delivery methodology. That's false. There needs to be alignment, but a project management office, which typically responsibilities relate to governance, particularly if they're more mature, is about governance. It's not about delivery. Delivery is the delivery teams who are executing projects and initiatives. So when we think about governance, we're thinking about supporting the submission of timesheets, or building schedule, or putting in quality stage gates and controls. It's about making sure the right resources are on the right projects at the right time. When we think about Agile delivery in practice and Agile governance in practice, Agile delivery, again, is based on all of those methods and frameworks and things like that. And again, based on your organization's maturity. Whereas when we think about it from a governance perspective, it's about how do we help delivery to be able to move at the speed of which we need them to move, or which they're trying to get to. How do we remove the impediments along the way while we're doing that driving on that road? How do we remove the hurdles, the roadblocks? How do we let them know when the red flags are coming, when the traffic lights are coming? We need to be able to help guide them on that journey. And governance really should be a few steps ahead of delivery, to be honest, because it's the eyes and ears of what's coming up from a sort of a roadmap perspective, like what's coming up that you need to be aware of, and also making sure that others along the way are also aware. Don't cross the road here because there's this initiative coming, and so forth. So I think people sometimes assume that it's one and the same, but it's not. So just something to think about. So if you think about governance, forgetting Agile Waterfall for now, fundamentally, if you haven't seen this already, governance is, I would collate it into 3 buckets: structure, people, and information. Structure, people, and information. If you are building out an approach for your organization's Agile delivery, Agile governance, make sure that you emphasize a focus point on structure, people, and information. Structure, again, it's how do we do things right? What is the accountabilities? What is the paths and process flows and approvals? And, what are the things we have to do? We may not want to have 6 or 7 or 8 stage gates anymore. We probably don't need that in some Agile-based methods, but how do we make sure that the organization's delivery teams are not going to spend all the money and deliver no value? So what can we do to measure that? Like, what can we put in place? One executive recently was telling me that at the moment, he's absolutely struggling to see how 1,000 initiatives are tracking, because whenever he asks the team of how things are going, they ask him to look at the Jira board. Now, if you're talking about an executive, they're not going to look at 1,000 Jira boards. No one has time for that. So this is why it's important that as governance, our role is to bring the information in a way that's lean and just in time, not just in case, to the executives, as well as making sure that we can help delivery by identifying things that may be happening in other areas of the organization. So structure is also about communications. Then when we think about people, this is where we're talking about things like, people don't think governance has anything to do with staff retention, or it doesn't have anything to do with culture. It actually does. It's quite significantly aligned. Anything people related has an element of governance to it, whether it's hiring, recruiting, performance managing, etc. Some of those things are not directly project related, but some of them are. And so we need to make sure we have clarity around the structure for supporting people. And then information. Information is tools, it's methods, it's policies, it's processes, it's procedures. It's all of the things that you need, again, the structure around information. Now, this may sound like a lot, but you can actually introduce it in a way that is quite lean to start with by testing some ideas and concepts and things. And I'll share a few of those with you in a minute. So I shared this before. I wanted to know if there's any comments or questions at this point based on sort of the things that we're covering so far. Anyone want to share anything that's come to mind or something they've seen? Okay, that's fine, no problem. I take it that this is useful then. Okay, so this is something that I shared, as I mentioned just at the beginning. I was describing it instead of visualizing it. Something to think about. Again, people assume that they don't need governance. Often when I deal with teams, they say to me, we don't need governance. What governance do we need? And then I say, have you seen yourselves without governance? If you look at an organization like one I have recently worked with, it is absolutely chaos. I've spent a few months somewhere recently, and I have to admit, I personally was like, I've got to get out of here. The team had a 70% turnover rate for one team because it is so disconnected and nobody knows what the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. There's no structure. The people side is not looked after, and the information is impossible to find. Because what people do is they go and bring in those fancy tools, Jira, Confluence, etc., which are great, by the way, but they bring them in and they don't put any structural guardrails around it. Then they wonder why they can't find anything that they need to find. For example, in this organization, the business requirements activities are being done by the subject matter experts in Word documents, and the development of the requirements is being done in Jira. So there's a disconnect between requirements sign off and the work being developed out in Jira. It's just confusing, and the two don't align up. So what ended up happening is they duplicated the work. So the developers were having to recreate, the journey experts rather, recreate the requirements in Jira when they could have just been done there to begin with if someone had given the SMEs the training or the guidance and guardrails around the information and how it's going to be tracked. So again, this is a governance thing that governance can help to solve, particularly if you're running a project management office function rather. So as I said, ultimately governance provides the roadmap, so everybody knows where they're going, and it's really important for us to remember that. At the top of our mind is always to think about that. When we think about agile governance, these are some of the key barriers. Not all of them, but these are some of the key ones. I'm curious if anyone else wants to share any others that they're seeing, but these are some of the core focus points that I'm currently seeing. Within that, I've briefly mentioned around the adoption of principles versus frameworks. There's a lot of confusion around that because depending on where Agile starts, if it's not clear up front that we're applying this framework or we've created a hybrid of it or whatever it might be, it ends up being quite confusing. And so it's really important to get that clarity up front. It's also really important to make sure that people have the experience, not just the theory, training of the theory. They need to have the practical experience and the opportunity to actually have a way to apply what they've learned. Many organizations now are just bringing in consultants to train on theory, and then they're expecting people to get it, and they just won't. Think about how long it takes us to get project management. I mean, there's courses out there, we've got to do training, and it takes like 10,000 hours and all that sort of stuff. So we need to think about that as a bit of a disconnect. And then also the waterfall versus agile. Okay, where does waterfall start? Where does agile start? Give you an example. With one organization, they were running a large transformation program, $250 million in value. They decided they were going to do everything waterfall until they got to the end of design. Build, test, deploy onwards was going to be done in agile sprints, but everything leading to that was going to be done in waterfall. Is that bad or good? It's not bad or good. It doesn't matter. That's what they agreed, and they put the guardrails around it and everybody was clear. So actually it was quite effective. Another example that I would share is in another organization in the automotive space. They had 3 different methodologies that people could choose to use. One was agile, one was waterfall, and one was a hybrid of both based on continuous improvement, continuous development. Is that bad? It's not bad or good because they educated people on them and gave people choice. But for every one of those frameworks, they had guardrails around it. Personally, I would probably stick with one to keep it simple, but giving people so many choices might actually end up being more problematic down the line. Do these challenges resonate with you? Happy if you want to put it in the comments or use an emotion or call out. But is there any other ones that come to mind for you guys?
I think that's pretty spot on what you have in there.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to add something, but I think it's falling somewhere within the adoption of principles versus frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
What I've certainly seen as potential barriers, which can be worked through, is where people just have a negative association with the word governance.
Yeah.
And I guess that falls in line with that mindset change, because it's actually a really, really good thing to have a set of principles or boundaries or parameters that you operate within.
Mm-hmm.
That can still be very flexible and still provide autonomy to do what you need to do to make decisions around your work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much context that's missing from resources online.
Yeah.
I think more needs to be done to get people comfortable with having and applying governance in agile delivery.
Mm-hmm. Yep, 100%. You're spot on, Michelle, because if you think about the people that usually don't like agile, I tell you now, is the people that have been burnt by it. Just like the people who don't like PMOs, right? There is people that don't like PMOs, that don't know why, but they've had a bad experience and they don't like it. Not because they understood it, they've applied it, they did it for 3 or 4 years, and then they realize, you know what, it doesn't provide value. There is so much evidence that organizations that move to agile, there is significant upside. The benefits are there, particularly if you do it right. If you don't, it costs you a lot more, but you'll maybe eventually get there. So if they don't get it, it's because I'll tell you now, it's because they have not taken the time to understand it, research it, do the training, etc. I know someone like that right now that I'm just like, I know you're saying that, it's because you haven't given it the time. And then the other reason is it's been poorly rolled out, and you only get one shot to introduce something as big and significant as introducing Agile or, introducing any delivery-based methodology, right? You get one shot at it. If you don't do a great job at it, you do tend to get people offside. And if you don't do it right the first time, people will revert back to their habits, which means the culture doesn't change, and then you're back at square one. So that's very, very common. It's unfortunate, but it is something that definitely is happening. Another thing to watch out for is your vendors. I wrote an article about that on my blog the other day. Watch out for vendors, because what vendors tend to be doing is the vendors are using Agile as an excuse to get around delivery, right? I'm a consultant and I run a consultancy, and I'm telling you now that some consultancies are running circles around clients because they're telling them, oh, we're Agile, we're only going to give you a quote for the next 2 weeks, and we're going to give you 2 weeks sprint quotes. Like, what? Hang on a minute. We all should know where we're going, right? We all should know what the guardrails are. We need to know what our time and cost, a fixed time and cost is, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one of the things to watch out for as well, that we need to think about.
I'm so glad you said that. Same.
Good. I'm glad.
It's a constant conversation that I keep having over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And how that's represented from a governance perspective is always very unreliable.
Yes.
Because I currently have a vendor who's been around for 6 months, who's delivered 30%, but their governance reporting is showing up the project as green.
Okay.
Very healthy.
Yeah, I had a very big consultancy in one of the teams I was working in years ago that took 6 months, and they couldn't provide an earned value report, which is, a waterfall thing. Like, they should know how to do that. So 6 months and you couldn't provide that. Another vendor saying they were only going to quote in 2 experience, and I had one of the executives come and say, "Is that normal?" And I said, "That's not normal. They're pulling your leg." And then I've got another vendor who another executive I was recently talking to. What they experience is, and this is also a red flag, the vendor coming in and saying, "You organization are going to run your projects using our methodology." That's not good, because if you've got 20 or 30 suppliers and there's 20 or 30 ways of working, that's work for you, and you're paying them to make your life more difficult. What I would suggest with that is a few ideas. One, you could introduce some like umbrella terms of agreement. Now, this is a vendor management sourcing thing, but the umbrella terms around the guardrails around delivery. You can also introduce things like collaboration agreements, which is something I've done quite often, which talks about how we will deliver projects together and so forth. So, yeah, definitely get around that for sure.
I really like that idea of having a collaboration agreement.
Yes.
Are there any resources like that available from your end?
I've actually probably going to write another blog about it, to be honest, because I'm actually building one at the moment. It's a confidential one for the client. So I'm building one at the moment. So I can't share that one, but I can definitely talk. I've talked about it in the most recent article on our website. I think there's an article that's just been posted. You'll probably find more about it in there, actually. I think it went out last week.
I'll definitely check that out, because it's an area that I'm looking into, because I'm just a recent new start to this company as well. So I'd really like to focus attention to engagement with vendors and setting up agreements like this in terms of ways of working.
Perfect.
and getting some alignment and agreement to how we move forward, because I think if you don't, it poses potential risk in delivery to the project, and also blowing out timelines and not getting what you expected to come out of it.
100%.
Thank you for that. That's a gold nugget for me.
Excellent. I'm glad. Wonderful. My work is done. It just sounds good. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. There is a lot more ideas. I mean, I've got some on the screen now. If I break down a few things when we think about the next level, when we think about, PMOs evolving and advancing. And PMOs is the term I'm using, but that could be portfolio management, delivery function, whatever you call your function. The things that you've got in here on this list are the stuff in purple, the stuff you should be doing anyway. The stuff in orange is like sort of the next level. Some functions do it, some don't. Then we think about sort of the items in yellow. So it's like extra things to think about, like, can we take over comms to better align communications with vendors and yada, yada, yada. Tool management, maybe you take ownership of the Jira and Confluence set and the guidelines and how to use that rather than just letting everyone be a free-for-all. And then the items in green are sort of the next level up. I've seen some functions introduced in Scrum Masters and oversee them. There is specialist teams. There might be things you can do around improving culture and engagement that you can do with working with HR, etc. So there's a lot of different sort of ideas. So I've got something for you that you can all have. There's a link there. I'll just copy it. Actually, I'll copy that and send it out. But if you go to our website, under the Agile Ideas drop down, there's a publications drop down, and what we've created is a free pocketbook that takes you through what Agile is. I'll just show you a quick example of that because I think you might find it useful, just so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. I'll just pull it up 1 second, and then I'll share my screen again, and then I'll show it to you. So hopefully you find this useful. I will just share my screen again. All right, so what I've got is we've created a free pocketbook that looks like this. And what you'll find is it's got a whole bunch of stuff around Agile, culture, all this sort of what is Agile, history, big A versus small a, and there's a lot more stuff. So what this will be probably helpful for if you've got people in your organisation that don't really get Agile, or maybe you're on the earliest part of your journey, you can basically go in and have a read of this. And there's some links in there to some stuff as well. But yeah, that's on our website, downloadable now for anyone who would like it as well. That's pretty much it for now. I will just leave you with one final comment. If you did find this helpful, testimony on LinkedIn would be amazing. I would absolutely appreciate that very much. And if you've got any other questions, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, thank you for your time, for joining me, and look forward to having a chat further with anyone on LinkedIn as we move forward.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you very much. That was awesome. Love your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Please share this with someone or rate it if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and to stay up to date with all things Agile Ideas, go to our website www.agilemanagementoffice.com. I hope you've been able to learn, feel, or be inspired today. Until next time, what's your Agile idea?